They woke before sunrise, the way people do when they believe nothing bad can happen. The air was cold, clean, and still, carrying the quiet promise of an ordinary day. Only one person truly matters at first: Evan Hale, a careful, soft-spoken man who trusted preparation more than luck. He had planned this short trip into the woods for weeks, telling himself it was necessary, even therapeutic. Work had been loud, life heavier than usual, and the forest offered something rare: silence. Evan packed methodically, checking supplies twice, tightening straps, sipping lukewarm coffee while pale light crept through the trees. There was no rush, no anxiety, only routine and familiarity. He recorded a short voice note on his phone, mostly for habit, promising to check in later that afternoon. The message was casual, almost forgettable, his voice steady, unafraid. Around him, the woods felt welcoming, alive but calm, birds stirring, leaves barely moving. What Evan didn't notice was how quiet the deeper forest remained, how certain animals watched without retreating. A deer stood between trees, unmoving, eyes fixed longer than necessary. Evan smiled at it, interpreting stillness as peace. He stepped onto the narrow trail, boots crunching softly, breath visible in the morning air. With each step, the signal on his phone weakened, bars fading one by one. He noticed but shrugged it off, already mentally unpacking the day ahead. Behind him, the trail erased itself, leaves settling, branches swaying back into place. By the time the sun rose fully, Evan was deep enough inside the woods that the world he came from no longer followed. This was the last moment everything was normal, though no one could have known it then. Later, when calls went unanswered, this morning would be replayed, slowed, examined for warning signs, for mistakes. But at the time, Evan only felt calm, unaware that silence had already begun to watch him. The path narrowed, bending away from familiar landmarks, guiding him deeper, whether he noticed or not. Some instinct whispered caution, but routine spoke louder, and he listened to the voice that felt reasonable. Evan adjusted his pack, paused once, and glanced back toward the trailhead now hidden by trees. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being observed lingered like a thought he couldn't name. He laughed quietly, dismissing it as nerves, then continued forward, unaware this decision would later define every question asked. Hours would pass before anyone realized something was wrong, before concern replaced patience. For now, the woods closed gently behind him, holding their breath, waiting. And far beyond the reach of cell towers, help and answers remained impossibly distant. By evening, the silence that felt peaceful this morning would feel like an accusation, unanswered and unforgiving. The last normal morning ended without drama, without witnesses, and without a single sound of alarm. All that remained was a missing signal, a fading trail, and a forest that did not intend to give him back easily. By the time the first worried call rang out, the woods had already decided to keep their secrets hidden, leaving only silence to answer back. Forever waiting. The silence did not announce itself all at once. It crept in quietly, the way unease always does, disguised as patience. At first, no one worried. Evan was experienced, careful, the kind of person who followed plans. Missing one check-in meant nothing, or at least that was what everyone told themselves. By late afternoon, his phone remained unreachable. Messages sent but never delivered. The forest swallowed the signal completely, leaving only a hollow ringing tone on the other end. This was when Maya Hale, Evan's younger sister, entered the story, though she didn't know it yet. She stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the clock as minutes stretched into something heavier. Maya tried to reason with the quiet. Maybe he'd lost track of time. Maybe the battery was low. The narration later would describe her denial as normal, almost necessary. Panic, after all, feels irresponsible until it is unavoidable. She left one voicemail, then another, her tone carefully casual, as if sounding worried might somehow make it real. As daylight faded, the silence changed. It stopped feeling empty and began to feel intentional. The woods were no longer simply unresponsive, they were withholding something. Maya's third call went straight to voicemail. The fourth never connected at all. Each failed attempt tightened something in her chest she could not loosen. When evening came, concern spread outward. A park office was called. Then a ranger station. Evan's name was written down, spelled carefully, as if precision could control what was happening. Questions followed. Experience level. Route plans. Last known contact. Each answer created space for doubt instead of comfort. Night settled over the forest long before it reached the town. Somewhere beneath the canopy, Evan's phone lay silent, its last location already outdated. Maya sat awake, scrolling through old photos, replaying the sound of his voice message from that morning. In it, he sounded calm, almost cheerful. That memory hurt more than fear. By midnight, hope had thinned into something brittle. The official words "missing person" were spoken for the first time, not shouted, but whispered with care. A report was filed, and with it came an unspoken understanding. Whatever had delayed Evan was no longer small. While paperwork moved slowly, the forest remained unchanged. Animals continued their routines. Wind passed through branches. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted, unnoticed by those still outside looking in. The silence was no longer absence. It was pressure. Maya fell asleep near dawn, phone clutched in her hand. When she woke, there was still nothing. No updates. No signal. No sign that the woods intended to respond. The waiting had transformed into something louder than sound, filling every moment with questions that had no answers yet. By morning, the decision was made. Search teams would enter the forest. The quiet that began as patience had become a warning, and soon, people would step into it, unaware of how little the woods planned to reveal. Before sunrise fully broke, Maya called again, even though she knew it was useless. The sound of dialing felt like action, like resistance. Outside her window, the world moved on indifferently, cars passing, lights turning on. Inside her mind, everything remained frozen at the moment Evan should have answered. She would later struggle to explain this feeling to investigators, how waiting felt physical, like standing in rising water without knowing when it would reach her mouth. The silence was no longer passive. It was shaping decisions, pulling strangers toward the woods, preparing to become something far more disturbing than anyone expected. And with that first search call, the forest prepared to be entered, questioned, and misunderstood again. The first search team entered the forest just after sunrise, carrying maps, radios, and the fragile optimism that comes with early hours. They moved carefully, spreading out along the trail Evan had planned to follow, calling his name into the trees. Their voices felt small, absorbed instantly, as if the woods had learned how to keep sound for itself. At first, everything looked ordinary. Footprints appeared in damp soil, matching the size and tread of Evan's boots. A crushed patch of grass suggested a short rest, maybe a pause to adjust his pack. These signs reassured the team, feeding the belief that he was nearby, just out of sight, waiting to be found. But then the trail changed. The footprints thinned, wandered, then stopped entirely near a bend where the forest grew dense and uneven. Searchers circled the area, scanning the ground, expecting to find a slip, a fall, something that explained the break. Instead, they found nothing human beyond that point. No scuff marks. No broken branches. Just an abrupt absence. One of the volunteers noticed the first animal tracks before anyone else did. Deer, by the look of them, fresh and clearly defined. That wasn't unusual. What unsettled him was their direction. They crossed Evan's path and lingered there, as if something had held their attention. The tracks overlapped, looped back, then continued deeper into the trees. Radios crackled as the team regrouped. A ranger knelt near the disturbed earth, studying it longer than necessary. He didn't say much, only that they should widen the search grid. His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered on the ground, thoughtful, uneasy. As they moved farther in, the forest grew quieter. Birds were scarce. Insects barely stirred. The air felt heavy, insulated, swallowing every shout. When someone called Evan's name, it didn't bounce back. It simply disappeared, leaving behind an uncomfortable stillness. More animal signs emerged. Broken twigs at chest height. Bark scraped from a tree trunk. Not violent, not frantic, just present. The team documented everything, careful not to disturb the scene, though no one could quite explain what the scene was yet. By midday, the mood had shifted. Hope was still there, but it was strained, stretched thin by the lack of progress. One searcher admitted quietly that he felt like they were following the forest's rules now, not their own. No one laughed at the comment. They paused near a shallow ravine, scanning downward. The ground there was soft, perfect for tracks, yet Evans were nowhere to be seen. Only animal prints remained, layered over one another, as if time itself had moved differently in this place. The ranger finally spoke what others were thinking. Animals usually scatter when humans move through their territory. Here, they hadn't. They'd stayed close, circling paths where Evans should have been. Watching, perhaps. Waiting. The team pressed on until late afternoon, exhaustion setting in alongside doubt. When they emerged briefly into a clearing, sunlight felt intrusive, almost wrong. The woods behind them looked unchanged, indifferent to the concern they carried in with them. By the time the search was called for the day, nothing new had been found. No pack. No clothing. No sign of injury. Only the unsettling knowledge that the forest had offered clues, but none that made sense yet. As they headed back toward the trailhead, one searcher glanced over his shoulder, certain for a moment that something had shifted behind him. He saw nothing. Still, the feeling stayed. Tomorrow, they would return with trackers, specialists, people trained to read what others could not. Because whatever had happened to Evan was no longer simple. And the woods, silent and unresponsive, had already begun to suggest that this disappearance followed a pattern they hadn't recognized yet. The specialists arrived early, stepping into the forest with a confidence that came from years of reading what others overlooked. Their presence changed the rhythm of the search. Movements became slower, voices lower, as if everyone sensed that this was no longer about covering ground, but about understanding behavior. Among them was Daniel Crow, a tracker whose reputation preceded him. He didn't speak much at first. He crouched near the place where Evan's footprints had vanished and studied the soil like it was a language he'd nearly forgotten how to read. Others watched him carefully, waiting for reassurance that never came. Daniel traced the animal tracks with 2 fingers, following their arcs and overlaps. Deer, elk, smaller mammals. All normal species. What wasn't normal was how they behaved. The tracks doubled back repeatedly, forming loose circles around a central point where no human sign existed anymore. Animals, Daniel explained quietly, don't waste energy like that without reason. The team moved deeper, following the strange patterns. In places, animal prints layered so densely they obscured the ground beneath. It looked less like movement and more like congregation. Daniel paused often, listening, scanning the trees. His unease spread silently to the others. One of the rangers asked the question everyone carried. Could predators have chased Evan off the trail? Daniel shook his head. If that were the case, the signs would be chaotic, violent. Instead, these tracks were deliberate. Almost patient. They reached a clearing where the forest opened briefly. Sunlight revealed scuffed earth and flattened leaves. Still no sign of Evan. No blood. No torn fabric. Only animals had marked this place, and they had done so repeatedly, returning again and again. Daniel finally spoke more directly. Animals usually avoid areas where humans linger. Here, they were doing the opposite. They stayed close, revisiting paths Evan should have walked. He admitted he'd seen similar patterns only a handful of times, usually when something vulnerable remained in one place for too long. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Something had delayed Evan, injured him, trapped him, long enough for the forest to notice. As afternoon wore on, tension tightened. Every snapped branch felt intentional. Every shadow suggested movement just beyond sight. The woods seemed less like terrain and more like a system responding to disturbance. Daniel stopped suddenly near a fallen tree. He pointed out claw marks in the bark, low and old, mixed with fresh ones. Not an attack, he clarified. More like marking, claiming. The animals hadn't fought over this space. They had shared it. The search team documented everything, but documentation felt inadequate. Patterns mattered more than proof now. And the pattern was wrong. When they finally pulled back for the day, Daniel lingered behind, eyes fixed on the path leading deeper into the forest. He said nothing, but the look on his face unsettled those who noticed it. Later, as plans were made to extend the search radius, Daniel gave a quiet warning. Whatever happened to Evan hadn't caused panic among the animals. It had caused interest. That night, as darkness returned and the forest settled, the animals resumed their routines. Somewhere out of sight, tracks would continue to form, overlapping patiently. And with each passing hour, the truth grew harder to face. The woods weren't hiding chaos. They were revealing order. An order that suggested waiting, not fleeing. Tomorrow, the search would push further, and the meaning of those tracks would become impossible to ignore. Sleep came poorly for the searchers that night. Radios lay silent, but no one trusted the quiet anymore. Daniel replayed the patterns in his mind, each circle leading nowhere yet pointing inward. By morning, specialists would return with fresh eyes, drones, and dogs, but instincts told him tools would not be enough. The forest was not resisting the search. It was allowing it, slowly, on its own terms, preparing them for something none of them wanted to find. Soon, the night itself would begin to change. Forever subtly. Night came faster than anyone expected. One moment the forest held its dim afternoon light, and the next it seemed to collapse inward, shadows stacking between trees. The decision to pause the search was practical, justified by safety protocols, but it felt wrong the moment it was spoken aloud. No one said it, yet everyone felt it. Stopping now meant leaving Evan alone with whatever had already noticed him. Temporary lights were set near the trailhead, casting pale circles that barely touched the darkness beyond. Radios hummed softly. Searchers moved with quieter steps, their confidence drained by the realization that the woods did not behave the same way at night. Daniel Crow stood apart, watching the tree line, listening to sounds others tried to ignore. As darkness settled, the forest changed character. Nocturnal animals stirred, but not chaotically. Movement came in slow, deliberate bursts. Something brushed against undergrowth, then stopped. An owl called once, then fell silent. The absence of sound afterward felt deliberate, like a held breath. Against protocol, a small team made one last sweep near the ravine. Their headlamps cut narrow tunnels through the dark, illuminating branches, bark, and ground that looked unfamiliar now. Every reflection felt like eyes. Every shift of shadow suggested presence just outside the beam. One searcher froze when he heard movement behind him. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just there. He turned sharply, heart pounding, and found nothing. Still, the sensation lingered, a quiet certainty that something had watched, measured, then chosen not to reveal itself. Daniel crouched near the fallen tree again, studying the ground under artificial light. The tracks looked different now. Deeper. More layered. Some were fresh, pressed into soil that had been undisturbed hours earlier. Animals had returned after the searchers left, reclaiming the space without fear. A ranger whispered what no one wanted confirmed. Predators should avoid human scent, especially fresh. Yet here, they hadn't. They moved closer, not farther away. Daniel said nothing, but his silence confirmed the concern more clearly than words could have. The team pulled back reluctantly as the cold deepened. Somewhere beyond the light, branches snapped softly, too controlled to be random. Radios crackled, then went quiet. When someone called out Evan's name one final time, the sound vanished instantly, absorbed without echo. At camp, exhaustion mixed with unease. No one slept well. Some stared into the dark, others replayed moments from the day, searching for reassurance that never came. Daniel sat alone, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, mapping circles only he seemed to understand. In the early hours, a distant howl carried through the trees. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It wasn't answered. The silence afterward felt heavier than noise, pressing inward, reshaping thoughts. By morning, everyone would agree something had changed overnight. The forest no longer felt passive. It felt engaged. The animals had not fled the disturbance of humans. They had adapted to it, weaving around it, staying near the places that mattered. As the first gray light approached, Daniel stood and packed his gear. He already knew what the next step would be. Specialists would bring dogs, drones, anything that could interpret what human eyes could not. Because whatever held Evan now was not chaos or chance. Nightfall had shifted the balance. And with daylight coming, the search would enter a phase that offered fewer assumptions and far more fear. Morning light returned reluctantly, thin and gray, filtering through the trees as if unsure it was welcome. The search teams moved again with quieter urgency, bringing dogs, cameras, and equipment meant to translate silence into meaning. What they found first was not a body, not a voice, but something far more confusing, evidence that suggested Evan had survived longer than anyone hoped or feared. Near the ravine, a torn food wrapper lay half-buried under leaves. It wasn't scavenged. No teeth marks. No tearing. Just opened, clumsily, by human hands. A few yards away, a jacket sleeve was discovered draped over a branch at waist height, as if deliberately placed. The fabric was damp, cold, but intact. This should have been encouraging. Instead, it unsettled everyone. Daniel studied the items without touching them. People in distress don't abandon warmth easily, he said. Not unless they're confused, overheated, injured, or trying to mark their path. But the placement didn't form a trail. It formed a cluster, almost like a boundary. The dogs reacted strangely. One circled the area repeatedly, whining, refusing to follow scent deeper into the trees. Another stopped abruptly and sat, ears pinned back, staring toward a darker section of forest. Handlers exchanged glances. Animals were supposed to lead them forward, not hesitate. More signs appeared as the search expanded. A shallow depression in the ground, shaped like someone had rested there. Bent grass, still springing slowly back. The signs were recent. Evan had been alive here. Recently enough to matter. Then came the warning. Food left untouched. A protein bar, unopened, lying beside the depression. No rodents. No birds. Nothing had gone near it. In a forest this active, that was wrong. Daniel crouched, scanning the perimeter. Scavengers avoided places they sensed danger. Whatever had passed through here left a signal animals understood instinctively. A radio crackled as one ranger reported something similar nearby. Clothing scraps. No blood. No struggle. Just abandonment. The narrative no longer fit accident or simple injury. Something had altered Evan's behavior. The team found marks on trees again. Claw lines, old and new, layered together. Not aggressive. Not frantic. Repeated. Marking the same area, over time. Animals had returned here again and again, but still left certain objects untouched. Daniel finally spoke the words no one wanted to hear clearly. This looked like prolonged vulnerability. Someone unable to move freely. Someone remaining in one place long enough for the forest to adjust around them. Hope twisted into dread. If Evan was alive, he was deteriorating. Physically. Mentally. Alone long enough for instincts, human and animal, to blur together. The forest wasn't chasing him. It was accommodating him, reshaping itself around his presence. Searchers pushed forward carefully, aware now that speed could destroy fragile clues. The dogs followed reluctantly, every step measured. Radios stayed low. No one called out anymore. Noise felt intrusive, disrespectful. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the evidence stopped abruptly again. No trail forward. No explanation. Just absence, edged by animal signs that grew denser the closer they looked. Daniel stood at the boundary, staring into the trees ahead. He didn't need maps to know what came next. The search was no longer about finding where Evan went. It was about understanding why he stopped. And somewhere deeper in the woods, beyond sight and sound, the pattern suggested he hadn't been alone when he did. The forest did not announce the shift. It simply allowed it to happen. Beyond the boundary where signs had ended, the search slowed to something almost ceremonial. Every step felt consequential, as if moving forward meant crossing into a version of events that could not be undone. Daniel sensed it immediately. This was no longer a rescue moving toward a living voice. This was an approach toward a truth already forming. The first clear sign came from Evan himself. They found a notebook page wedged between rocks near a streambed, protected from wind and rain. The paper was creased, the writing uneven. Not a message meant for discovery, but fragments of thought. Lines written, crossed out, rewritten again. Dates were missing. Time had lost meaning here. The words spoke of cold, thirst, and an overwhelming sense of being watched, though never directly threatened. Daniel read silently, his jaw tightening. The language wasn't panicked. It was disoriented. Evan wrote about staying still, about conserving energy, about sounds that came closer when he moved and retreated when he didn't. He questioned whether it was safer to remain unseen than to signal for help. Somewhere between logic and fear, his instincts had changed. The team pressed forward. Signs of prolonged survival appeared quickly now. A makeshift shelter formed from branches, poorly constructed but intentional. Scorch marks from a small fire, burned low, carefully hidden. Evan hadn't wanted smoke. He hadn't wanted attention. Whatever had shaped his decisions, it had convinced him that staying quiet was survival. Inside the shelter, the air felt heavy. A shallow indentation marked where he had slept, curled inward, conserving warmth. The smell of damp earth and fear lingered faintly, unmistakable to those trained to recognize it. Animals had been here too. Tracks surrounded the structure but did not cross inside. A perimeter, respected. Fragments of dialogue later recovered from Evan's recordings told a deeper story. His voice wavered, whispering as if volume alone might summon danger. He spoke to himself, argued aloud, questioned whether movement would invite pursuit. He wasn't running anymore. He was hiding. And hiding had become habit. Daniel felt the weight of it settle. This was the point Evan had stopped trying to leave. Not because he couldn't move, but because he believed movement was riskier than staying. The forest hadn't trapped him physically. It had convinced him psychologically. The searchers exchanged fewer words now. The realization moved through them quietly. Evan had crossed a line long before they had arrived. A place where logic bends under exhaustion and fear reshapes priorities. Survival had narrowed his world to stillness. Then they found blood. Not much. A smear on stone, old and darkened. An injury, manageable at first, likely worsened by exposure and delay. Enough to weaken him. Enough to slow him. Enough to justify staying put just a little longer. Long enough for the animals to learn his pattern. Hope existed, but it was fragile. If Evan was alive, he was near the edge of endurance. If he wasn't, the forest had already begun its quiet process of adaptation. Daniel stood at the shelter's edge, listening. No birds. No insects. Just the subtle awareness of space being shared. He understood now. The animals weren't hunting. They were monitoring. Waiting for change. This was the point of no return. Whether Evan crossed it alone or something followed him there remained unclear. But beyond this place, survival would no longer be about strength or preparation. It would be about time. And time out here did not favor the living for long. Understanding came slowly, not as revelation, but as accumulation. By the third day, the search no longer felt like pursuit. It felt like study. Experts arrived quietly, biologists and wildlife behaviorists who spoke less about Evan and more about the forest's response to him. Their language shifted the focus. This was not about predators behaving aggressively. It was about animals reacting predictably to something fragile. They walked the perimeter Daniel had marked, pointing out details others had missed. The lack of scavenging. The repeated returns. The way tracks approached, paused, and withdrew. Animals, they explained, are efficient. They don't linger without reason. They wait when the environment suggests an outcome without effort. The forest had read Evan correctly. Injured prey behaves differently. It stops migrating. It limits movement. It becomes quiet. Not to avoid danger, but because energy is finite. Animals recognize this pattern instinctively. They don't rush. They observe. The longer stillness persists, the more certain the outcome becomes. This wasn't hunting behavior. It was assessment. Daniel listened as one biologist traced overlapping tracks with a gloved hand. Deer, smaller predators, Even birds had altered their routes to pass near Evan's shelter. Not to attack. To check. To confirm change. Life monitoring weakness without interference. What disturbed the team most was the restraint. No signs of conflict. No feeding frenzy. The animals weren't competing. They were coexisting, each waiting for the same conclusion. Nature, in its most unsettling form, was being patient. They followed the pattern deeper, not toward violence, but toward convergence. The tracks narrowed, focusing inward. Whatever had happened to Evan after the shelter, it had happened nearby. Close enough for animals to stay aware, distant enough to avoid human intrusion. One handler noted how the dog's behavior mirrored the wildlife's. Hesitation. Observation. Refusal to advance without clear signal. Animals of different species responding the same way meant one thing. The situation had stabilized. For better or worse. Daniel finally spoke what had settled in his chest. The animals stayed because they expected something to end. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Naturally. The realization stripped away lingering illusions. This wasn't a race against predators. It was a race against decline. Against infection, exposure, exhaustion. Against the moment when Evan's presence would shift from living to something else the forest understood too well. Search strategies adjusted again. Less noise. Slower movement. Eyes trained low, not high. They weren't looking for motion now. They were looking for where motion had stopped. Late in the afternoon, wind moved through the trees differently. Birds returned briefly, then vanished again. Something had changed. The animals knew it before the humans did. Daniel felt it in his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with fear. He followed the signs, every instinct sharpened by grim clarity. The waiting was ending. Whatever the forest had been preparing for was close now. And when it revealed itself, it would not feel like discovery. It would feel like arrival. They found him at dusk, not hidden but sheltered, curled against the base of a fallen spruce where roots rose like ribs from the soil. For a moment no one spoke. The forest felt suspended, as if even the animals were waiting to see what humans would do next. Evan was alive. That fact came first, sharp and disorienting. His eyes were open, unfocused, tracking movement without recognition. When a medic said his name, Evan flinched, then whispered something too soft to understand. Relief surged, then stalled, tangled with confusion. He had lost weight, his skin gray with cold and dehydration. An infected gash ran along his calf, crudely wrapped with torn fabric. It explained the blood, the stillness, the decision to stop moving. Survival had narrowed his world to this small hollow, and leaving it now seemed to frighten him more than staying ever had. Animals had been here. Tracks surrounded the site in quiet testimony, but none crossed the space where Evan lay. Even now, as rescuers knelt close, birds remained distant. The forest watched, unchanged. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Evan cried out, panic surging. He grabbed Daniel's sleeve with surprising strength and begged him not to make noise. Not to let them see. His voice cracked, thick with conviction. Daniel leaned close, speaking softly, promising safety he wasn't sure Evan believed. On the way out, Evan drifted in and out of awareness. In brief moments of clarity, he tried to explain. He spoke of sounds that came closer when he moved, of shapes that stopped when he did, of understanding, slowly, that stillness kept him alive. His logic was broken, but not irrational. It had worked. At the trailhead, lights and voices overwhelmed him. He thrashed weakly, eyes wide, searching tree lines that were no longer there. When the ambulance doors closed, the forest disappeared, but whatever it had taught him did not. Later, officials would call this a successful rescue. Headlines would say found alive. The truth was quieter. Evan survived the woods, but the woods came with him. He never asked about the animals directly. Instead, he asked if they had stayed, if they were still waiting. Doctors attributed this to trauma, dehydration, infection. Reasonable explanations. Incomplete ones. Daniel returned to the site once more before leaving. Without Evan there, the clearing felt ordinary again. Tracks already blurred. Interest fading. The forest moved on quickly. Evan, however, did not. In the hospital, he startled at silence and calmed only when machines hummed. He avoided windows. When asked why he stopped moving, he gave the same answer every time. "They weren't chasing me," he said. "They were checking." Recovery would take months. Answers would never fully form. One person was saved. Another version of him remained in the woods. And as the search officially ended, a harder story began to surface. What Evan endured was not attack or pursuit. It was patience. And patience, once learned, is difficult to escape. The forest would release no statement, no explanation, only absence where a man had been. Searchers packed up, maps folded, radios silenced, yet unease followed them out. The animals dispersed quickly, interest fulfilled, patterns dissolving as if nothing unusual had occurred. What lingered instead was a question that refused closure, one that would draw investigators back into memory rather than terrain. For Daniel, the ending felt incomplete. He understood now why the animals stayed, but understanding offered no comfort. Evan would live, yet the experience had marked him in ways medicine could not chart. Somewhere between survival and surrender, something essential had shifted, and the forest had simply borne witness. The case file would close soon, but its meaning would expand. What happened next would not unfold in the woods, but inside Evan's recollections, where silence, waiting, and watching continued long after rescue. And that was where the real aftermath truly began. The weeks after Evan's rescue moved slowly, measured not by days but by fragments of memory that surfaced when his body was strong enough to speak. Investigators learned quickly that questions had to be asked gently. Evan's mind guarded its experience carefully, releasing pieces only when pressure eased. At first, his account focused on practical details. The fall near the ravine. The cut that wouldn't close. The cold that settled into his bones and never seemed to leave. He spoke clinically, detached, as if describing someone else. Doctors noted this as progress. Daniel recognized it as distance. Only later did the harder parts emerge. Evan described how sound changed in the forest. How footsteps, even his own, felt like signals sent outward. When he stayed still, the woods softened. When he moved, it sharpened. He learned this through trial and error, through fear rewarded by quiet. Stillness became safety. Silence became strategy. He spoke of animals without naming them. Shapes at the edge of vision. Movement that paused when he paused. He never claimed attack. Instead, he described presence, consistent and patient. They were not closing in, he said. They were checking if he still belonged among the living. Sleep deprivation and infection explained some of it. Hallucinations were noted in reports. But not all of it fit that frame. Evan recalled moments of clarity when fear receded, replaced by understanding. He knew when to breathe shallowly, when to wait, when not to hope for rescue too loudly. The decision to stop trying to leave came slowly. Each failed attempt cost energy he could not replace. Each return to the same shelter felt safer than risk. He told Daniel that moving felt like announcing himself. Staying felt like blending in. He wasn't hiding from animals. He was hiding from change. When asked why he didn't call out, Evan answered simply. Noise brought attention. Attention brought evaluation. Evaluation meant the waiting would end, one way or another. As long as he remained uncertain, the forest remained undecided. Weeks later, his story still arrived in pieces. A sentence here. A correction there. Guilt threaded through it. Guilt for surviving when the outcome felt negotiated rather than won. He struggled with the idea that survival had depended on being passive. Therapists spoke of trauma responses, of learned helplessness. Evan listened politely, then corrected them. He hadn't felt helpless. He had felt observed. There was a difference he could not fully explain. Daniel visited once before returning home. Evan thanked him, then asked a final question. Had the animals left after he was taken away? Daniel told him yes. Evan nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. The story ended not with rescue, but with release. When Evan was gone, the forest lost interest. Waiting had concluded. Understanding this did not comfort Evan. It unsettled him, because it meant survival had not been a triumph over nature, but alignment with it. He had lived by accepting his place in a system that did not care about intention. By the time the official report was completed, Evan's account was labeled incomplete but sufficient. For those involved, it was neither. What lingered was the realization that the woods had never chased him. They had simply watched, and in that watching, taught him how close life and surrender can feel. The story took weeks to tell because it was not a story of escape. It was a story of waiting. And waiting leaves marks that time does not easily erase. Those marks surfaced in quiet moments, in pauses between conversations, in the way Evan measured rooms and exits. Rescue ended the ordeal, but survival rewired him. The forest had instructed him without words, and that lesson followed him forward, shaping every silence, every decision, every instinct he carried back into ordinary life, without ever truly leaving. After the case officially closed, life resumed its shape around Evan, but it never quite fit the same way again. Doctors called his recovery remarkable. Friends called him lucky. Evan accepted the words politely, knowing none of them described what lingered beneath the surface. Survival had returned his body to the world, but part of him remained calibrated to a quieter set of rules. He avoided forests at first, then open parks, then any place where sound softened too completely. Silence felt different now. It no longer meant peace. It meant attention. In crowded rooms, he positioned himself where he could see entrances. At night, he slept with a low hum playing softly, anything to prevent the kind of quiet that once taught him how to endure. Investigators moved on. Reports were archived. Daniel returned to his work, carrying the case like a weight he couldn't set down. He understood now that not all rescues ended cleanly. Some saved lives but left truths behind, truths that refused to stay buried. Evan tried to explain it once, during a support session that ended early. He said the woods hadn't threatened him. They had adjusted to him. When he weakened, the world around him responded, not with violence, but with patience. That patience terrified him more than pursuit ever could, because patience implied certainty. He dreamed of the forest often, not of fear, but of stillness. In the dreams, animals stood at a distance, never approaching, never leaving, waiting for something he could not see. He always woke before understanding what they expected. Months later, he returned to the trailhead once, standing at the edge without stepping in. The forest looked unchanged. Trees stood where they always had. Birds moved freely again. No sign remained of the waiting that once shaped everything. Nature had erased the disturbance efficiently, as it always did. Evan understood then what had never left the woods. It wasn't danger. It wasn't malice. It was the quiet system beneath everything, the way life responds to weakness without judgment or urgency. The forest had not wanted him gone or alive. It had simply been ready either way. That realization followed him back to the city, into relationships, into moments of choice. He learned how thin the line was between action and surrender, between fighting and adapting. He learned that survival is not always loud or heroic. Sometimes it is small, invisible, and deeply unsettling. Years later, when asked about the experience, Evan offered fewer details. He said he was found. He said he recovered. He left out the rest. Some truths, he believed, were not meant to be shared, not because they were secret, but because they changed those who held them. The woods remained where they were, silent and indifferent, waiting for the next disturbance, the next lesson. Evan lived on, carrying what they taught him, moving carefully through a world that suddenly felt less solid than before. What never left the woods was not a memory or a threat. It was understanding. And once learned, it could not be unlearned.